Okay, hey everybody. I'm Alex Carner, Associate Professor of Community and Regional Planning. It's good to see you again. I am also Faculty Coordinator for City Forum, which is the event that you're currently attending. So we do it roughly bi-weekly. It's our seminar series where we invite scholars, activists, and practitioners to engage us in critical discussions around cities and regions. And often the people who come and speak have a particular focus on issues related to Austin. So today we're very excited to have Dr. Eric Tang presenting. Dr. Tang is an associate professor in the African and African Diaspora Studies Department here at UT Austin. He also directs the Center for Asian American Studies, as well as an undergraduate major on race, indigeneity, and migration. His first book, Unsettled, Cambodian Refugees in the New York City Hyperghetto, is an ethnographic account of refugee life in some of New York City's most impoverished and marginalized neighborhoods. A former community organizer, Tang has published several articles on race and urban social movements, including award-winning work on post-Katrina New Orleans that appeared in American Quarterly. His opinion writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other outlets. And locally, Tang's research focuses on the past and present of racial segregation in Austin, Texas, paying particular attention to gentrification-driven displacement of the city's long-standing black residents. He co-authored the report Outlier, the case of Austin's declining African-American population, which revealed that Austin was the only major growing city in the United States to experience an absolute numerical decline in black residents. So I was excited to invite Dr. Tang to speak with us for a couple reasons. First, I knew we were having our admitted graduate student open house, and thought it would be a great opportunity for admitted students to hear about some of the major ongoing issues that we're facing in Austin related to affordability, gentrification, displacement, and racialized exclusion. But second, it seemed like Dr. Tang's areas of interest and methods have a lot of overlap with the type of work that we do in community and regional planning. So I wanted to make the connection with the hope that we could begin an ongoing dialogue with folks in AADS and elsewhere on campus who are doing engaged activist scholarship aimed at addressing our pressing regional issues. So with that, we'll welcome Dr. Tang to City Forum. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to begin by first welcoming those who are thinking about coming to UT Austin. It's always exciting to be in front of prospective students and potential Austinites. This afternoon I'm going to talk about what it means to be a potential Austinite, and I'll begin by asking if anybody happened to, if you're new to town, experience I-35. Yeah? And what could you tell me about I-35?
I drove it last night, so it wasn't too bad. But it's quite a road.
Yeah, it's quite a road. A wise, long-time Austinite once said to me when I first moved here 13 years ago, the key to staying happy in Austin is to stay off of I-35. Would the locals agree? Okay. So it's the major interstate, and it, straight shot from here south to San Antonio, from here north to Dallas, and it's really indispensable if you're trying to get from one part of town to the other. But before there was I-35 here in Austin, at least in the section of I-35 that is currently part of downtown, before it was I-35, it was known as East Avenue. East Avenue. And East Avenue was the crude dividing line between black and white Austin. I wish I could say it was more nuanced than that, but it really wasn't. If there is some nuance, it's that it also segregated to a certain extent, to a considerable extent, the Mexican-American community from white Austin as well. So you have I-35, which runs north and south, right through the heart of the city, and on the west side of it was white Austin, and on the east side of it was black and Mexican-American Austin for most of the 19th and 20th century, and even into the 21st century. We could say that that is by and large true, although East Austin, or Central East Austin as it's known today, has changed demographically owing to gentrification. So not as black and brown as it once was, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So my talk today, the title at least, invokes East Avenue, because I want to really have a discussion with you in the Q&A about segregation and gentrification. But the data I will present from the outset comes from our policy brief published almost 10 years ago, called Outlier, the case of Austin's declining African-American population. And it's going to get into how Austin became the only major growing city in the United States to experience a simultaneous absolute decline in its African-American population. Okay? So a couple of key terms to begin with. A major city is here defined as any city with more than 500,000 people. And a major growth city or a major growing city is any such city with more than 10% growth in its general population within a 10-year period, and the 10-year period we're talking about is 2000 to 2010. So this data is based on the previous census, or two censuses ago, the 2010 census. Okay. So Austin's rate of growth between that decade, between 2000 and was a remarkable 20.4%. So among major cities, it ranked third in terms of its growth rate in the general population. Any questions so far about the key terms? Okay. So we began with a hypothesis, and the hypothesis was that major growth cities with double-digit growth, with over 10% growth in the general population, should also experience its African-American population. Okay. Now, African-American growth might not keep pace with general population growth in these cities, but there should be at least some positive growth in African Americans across all major growing cities. So in other words, we didn't expect that the African American population was going to grow at 20.4% to keep pace with the general population growth. But we did expect with that much growth that you would see growth in African Americans as well. So what did we discover? Every major growth city in the nation saw simultaneous growth in its African American population, save for Austin. In fact, no city with less than 8.5% general population growth saw any losses in African Americans. And again, Austin's growth was a remarkable 20.4%. If I could put this in visual terms, it would look like this. So here you have the 10 fastest major growing cities in the United States between 2000 and 2010. This third, right? 20.4% general population growth. Population growth is here represented by the turquoise bar. Is that turquoise? I think it is. And black population growth by the yellow bar. And so you can see that Fort, which is just 3 hours north of here, was the fastest growing major city in 2010. And it grew at a startling 38.6%. Coterminous with that was a 28% growth in its African American population. And then you had Charlotte, North Carolina, which the general population growth of 35%. And its black population growth during that same time actually exceeded general population growth at 43.5%. And then all of a sudden you see Austin. Growth. Its black population is moving in the opposite direction. So no other city does that. You can just see that by the graph, right? Most cities do this. Austin went like that, making it an outlier among its peers. So an important distinction needs to be made here. When we talk about a decline in the African American population in Austin, we're not just talking about a shrinking of its share of the population. We're talking about an absolute numerical decline. So Austin's black population went from 64,259 in 2000 to 60,760 in 2010. Now you might say that doesn't sound like a remarkable drop in, you know, a major racial population, but the key point here isn't the difference between the 64,259 and the 60,760. It's about those losses against tremendous growth. Meaning that during that decade, given all the people that moved to Austin, and I was included in that group, there weren't enough African Americans to make up for the huge losses that were happening simultaneously. Does that make sense? And so it's a loss in total numbers. Again, and this is what makes Austin a statistical outlier. It would be one thing if its numbers continued to grow, but its share shrunk because everyone else was growing faster. But to see its actual number decline was rather startling. In fact, it was something that we, when we first looked at it, ran the census data, didn't quite believe ourselves. So another thing that's important to emphasize is that we're not saying that Austin was the only major city in the United States to see a decline in African Americans. That's sometimes how people shorthand this research. That's not what we're saying. There are plenty of cities that saw a decline in their black populations. But those cities were not experiencing simultaneous double-digit growth. So here you have cities such as New York, Baltimore, San Jose, San Diego, DC, LA, Chicago, San Francisco, and Detroit. All of them saw losses in the black population. They either were growing themselves at single-digit growth, right? Oftentimes, at 5% or less, right? Or they were actually experiencing general population declines as well, right? And so the African American population losses in those major cities were happening parallel to their small in general or absolute population declines. Right? So that's what makes, again, Austin an outlier. That distinction is important to make as well. If we could do a regional comparative, how does Austin stack up against other major cities in Texas? Here again, it is the only major city in Texas to see a decline in its African American population between 2000 and 2010. San Antonio saw positive growth at 11.5% of its black population. In El Paso, the black population growth was neck and neck with general population growth. And again, in Fort Worth, you saw 28% black population growth. So here Austin is losing African Americans. And yet, I think it's fair to say that Austin, compared to these other Texas cities, has a reputation of being the most politically progressive, multicultural, and welcoming. Or at least that's the reputation that often, precedes it. And I think Austinites like to think of themselves as being different than the rest of Texas in that way too. Wouldn't you agree? I don't know how apt the metaphor of the blue oasis in the sea of red is anymore. Right now, the political situation is so crazy town that who knows if these metaphors hold. But in general, there's this reputation, yet this statistic stands out. So would love to hear your thoughts on that as well during the Q&A. Any questions so far? No, that's a great question. This data is limited to the city limits. And the reason why is because, Austin's famed city limits, right? Why shouldn't that hold true for conversations about race and class? But it's also because so much of the displacement is happening to cities and suburbs just outside of Austin. And why that is significant is because those cities and suburbs are places that we might think Austinites are moving to as a form of social mobility. But they may, in fact, be more about the suburbanization of poverty. And so we decided to limit our analysis to the city and not to the MSA. So why would this happen to Austin between 2000 and 2010? What explains this statistical anomaly? In my view, it has everything to do with the intersection of Jim Crow segregation and neoliberal gentrification. So a lot of adjectives here, but we'll break it down. Let's start with Jim Crow segregation. We all kind of have a general sense of what Jim Crow is, right? So southern state level and city level statutes that essentially rendered African Americans second-class citizens in all aspects of life: residential life, employment, public space, law enforcement. Jim Crow happened a little bit differently in this southern city, in the southern city of Austin. It wasn't as statutory here as it was in, say, Birmingham, right? There weren't these laws spelled out by city leaders around where African Americans could be or couldn't be. Most of it was implied. But in 1928, it was rather late in the history of Jim Crow, the city of Austin passed what it called a new master plan. And in that master plan, it called for the creation of a so-called Negro district. And that district would be just east of UT's campus. All right. Today, we would describe it as east of I-35, between roughly 7th Street to the south and, let's say, 24th Street to the north. And then its eastern border would be roughly Airport Boulevard today. Okay. So this was introduced in the master plan of 1928. An effort to consolidate and segregate African Americans to the east side. Up until this point, African Americans lived in communities all over Austin, in what is today Central and West Austin. Many of them are historic freeman communities, communities that were settled by freed slaves. So for those of you who've been around for a while, you may have heard of Clarksville, right? That was a freeman community. Wheatsville, another one, okay? And in 1928, what the city said was, we are determined to move as many African Americans from these central parts of Austin to the east side, where there was another concentration, beginning in what is known as Swedish Hill, east of today's I-35. And we're going to do that by placing all the public schools that African Americans are allowed to attend in this area. Because this is prior to 1954, prior to Brown versus Board, and it's constitutional to do that. In addition to that, we're going to let African Americans know that if they want to avail themselves of public amenities like parks, right, and other public spaces, that could only be done on the east side. And it also said, if you don't move from places, we will not develop those areas, paved roads and water meters, but if you move to the east side, you might. And so all of this amounted to compelling African Americans to move to the east side, and it was effective. Within a decade, about 80% of this black population, which was once, again, living in different parts of Austin, were now living in the so-called Negro district. So that's how Jim Crow happened in Austin. Right? It wasn't quite statutory, but it was encoded in the city plan. Okay. And so the other thing that is important about this to know about this master plan in 1928 is that it actually is written as a very technocratic document. Like, you would think that this would be like a manifesto on white supremacy. Well, it is, but a certain permutation of white supremacy that we might not be that familiar with. It wasn't as if these, the document is, rife with, explicit anti-black statements. Instead, it says, here is a plan, and it was drafted by a Chicago consultant to deal with the so-called segregation problem. And you wonder, like, well, whose problem is this? It was like kind of talked about as if we all know that, oh, this is a problem. We have to figure out how to solve this problem. And so it reads like a planning document. It reads like it's written by technocrats, because it is. And it's written in such a way that it kind of moves effortlessly between, trying to solve this segregation problem and also the problem of where to put unsightly industries. So it's like written together. And we'll also put like industries that are polluting in the same area. All right, so that's the kind of genre of writing that you're dealing with when you're reading this particular master plan of 1928. So what happens to this community that is, designated the Negro district? What happens after 1928? What are some of the outcomes? Well, the schools are separate and unequal because so many residents are forced to live in an area where polluting industries are also being built and extended. This community is dealing with environmental toxins, with environmental racism. Virtually all the public housing in Austin is relegated to the east side. And here's a piece of Austin trivia. Austin has arguably the first federally funded public housing in the United States, owing to the work of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was in Congress and was part of a group of policymakers that developed the idea of public housing, and he thought, well, why not set up some of the first projects in Austin? And of course, the city's largest concentrations of poverty and unemployment were also on the east side. This is the outcome of Jim Crow segregation. Okay. So, over the course of several decades, even as they are living separately and unequally, African Americans on the east side nevertheless build communities that they are proud of. They become homeowners. Right? They become professionals who serve this segregated community. You have doctors, dentists, pharmacists who all live on the east side and have their practices on the east side as well. And because of segregation, these doctors, dentists, and pharmacists are the only practitioners that African Americans are allowed to see. And this is late into the 20th century that this is happening. We're talking about the 1970s. It's not uncommon for African Americans to say, yeah, well, the only dentist I can see is the one who serves families on the east side. Okay. And so, again, as they're living under segregation, they're nevertheless building their communities. And something happens in the 1980s and 90s that is true of a lot of communities across the United States. And that is, you see how desegregation combined with shifts in the economy, right? A post-manufacturing, post-industrial economy, combined with the war on drugs and the crack epidemic, lead to the deepening of social problems in Black inner city communities, right? And you begin to see the younger generation move out, the younger generation of African Americans move out. You begin to see home values decrease on the East Side. You begin to see the conditions of housing deteriorate on the East Side as well. Fast forward a few more decades to the 1990s, property in Austin on the East Side is looked to as dirt cheap as a result, but also coveted because it's so close to downtown. So here is where we might, people who developed the map never quite imagined that this area would one day be coveted property by a new generation of young professionals who were thinking of gentrifying Austin. Gentrification wasn't really a term they thought of or anticipated back then. But because of these economic shifts, housing was cheap, people were ready to sell, and in the 1990s they began selling their properties in large numbers. And in the early 2000s, that really took the gentrification effect, that is. Okay. And so we can begin to see some of these shifts in the census data that we look at between 2000 and 2010. Okay. So, for example, between 2000 and 2010, the average poverty rate increase for tracts that experienced African American population losses was actually less than it was for those that experienced such losses. So on the East Side, the former Negro district, you see poverty rates decreasing, meaning there's less poverty. That less poverty, again, runs parallel with gentrification. We might explain this in the following way. Poor African American families were the ones who were primarily being pushed or driven out of these census tracts, and they were, quote, taking poverty with them. All right, so it wasn't that these African American families were doing economically better. It was that they were moving out and being replaced by others, and that's why you see the poverty rates decrease, or poverty, there being less poverty in those census tracts. That actually tracks with the gentrification effect. Are we good?
May we do handheld?
Absolutely, yeah.
Sorry about that.
No.
If we could just turn that.
In addition to this, is it on? It is, okay. In addition to this, the property values increase in the tracts experienced African American population losses. Right? So those those property values were considerably higher than in tracts that did not experience African American population losses. So again, this tracks with gentrification, right? Higher property values as African Americans move out. And thirdly, the property values, or these are more exact numbers to the same point. You see, in neighborhoods that saw losses of African Americans, there was an increase of $61,286 on average for property values, compared to $36,889 in other areas that did not experience Black population losses. In other words, property values soared after African Americans left the neighborhood. which again tracks with the gentrification effect. Okay. And then lastly, home ownership. Increases in those areas, suggesting that what? That between 2000 and 2010, the number of renters decreased. All right, so African American renters moved out and they were replaced by homeowners. Now we can see all this visually on these maps. So the purple represents census tracts with 80% plus African American population between 2000 and 2010. Excuse me, between 1990 and 2000. So you see how in that decade, the 80% plus population decreased rather significantly, right? Go from all the solid purple to kind of more fragmented purple in 2000. And now look at what happens to this between 2000 and 2010. I don't have a 2010 to 2020 map, but something tells me that there will probably be no more purple. I don't think there is an 80% plus in East Austin, unless it's the one that also houses or encompasses the students at Houston-Tillotson University, which is our historically black college here in Austin. And for those of you who want to get a geographic, was talking about earlier, believe this is I-35 right here. Right. Cuts right through, dividing east and west Austin. Okay. You know what? I think I'm going to stop there because I want to have a conversation with y'all. And I know you have to be somewhere in like 2:30, is that right? So if we can have like about half an hour of conversation, maybe that's the way to go. And, you know, I have some slides that tell us what's happening now based on the 2020 census data during the Q&A, because I'm sure someone's going to ask a question or two about that. Okay, so to summarize, to conclude, Jim Crow segregation, which effectively pushes African Americans to this one area of Austin, coincides with neoliberal gentrification, because what happens in the 1990s and early 2000s is that very area becomes a target of gentrification. Now, imagine we didn't have a situation where 80% of Austin's black population was compelled to move to this one area. Imagine that there were different pockets of African American communities in Austin throughout the 20th century. They could still be segregated and subject to some of the unequal racial practices of the city, but there would be more than one, let's say. Then what would happen is the gentrification effect wouldn't have so singularly impacted one community. Does that make sense? But because of the way the 1928 master plan played out, when you effectively put 80% of the city's black population in one part of the city, then when the forces of displacement via gentrification come along, that community is going to be singularly impacted, or not just disproportionately impacted, but singularly impacted. And that's what ultimately results in Austin being the only major growing city to experience an absolute decline in African Americans between 2000 and 2010.